Hi, everyone. Welcome to our 2 p.m. press conference, Penguins from Space. Our speakers this afternoon are Heather Lynch from Stony Brook University, Casey Youngflesh from the University of Connecticut, and Michael Polito from Louisiana State University.
Well, it is my great pleasure to kick things off today. We're really excited to share some of the latest developments in our work to survey and study penguins from space. My name is Heather Lynch. I'm from Stony Brook University. Oh, there we go. It is working. So just to set the stage for our conversation today, I just want to say a little bit about the Antarctic. As many of you already know, the Arctic and the Antarctic both are some of the most rapidly changing places on the planet. And one of the major threats that is faced in the Antarctic is the threats posed by climate change. So in the Antarctic, we have 4 species of penguins, all breeding in the Antarctic. And all of them are having to respond to changes in climate. Nowhere is the climate changing more rapidly than on the Antarctic peninsula here. And in fact, all 4 of those species breed right here up on the peninsula. But today we're going to be primarily focused on the Adélie penguin, the one in the upper left. And for decades, the Adélie penguin has been considered the canary in the coal mine for Antarctic change. One of the real paradigm-shifting advances in penguin science over the last decade is that we can survey penguins from satellites. And it's important to recognize that we don't see individual penguins in the satellite imagery, but what we do see is this pinkish stain left on the landscape by their guano, or actually the poop that is left behind by their occupation of the site. And you can see that quite well in the photograph that I've shown you here. And because penguins pack at a predictable density, we can work out from the area of the guano stain how many penguins must have occupied that site. So in 2014, a survey of penguin colonies using Landsat satellite imagery discovered several large but previously unknown penguin colonies in a region of the northern Antarctic peninsula called the Danger Islands. The Danger Islands, so called because they're almost always covered by a thick layer of sea ice all around that precludes regular censuses in this area. So when we discovered that there might be some very large penguin colonies in this region, we were very surprised because we had surveyed previously Heroina Island here in the north, and we didn't think there were other large colonies in the region. But of course, having discovered what looked to be some really significant populations in the region, we went ahead and organized an expedition to the region called the Danger Islands Expedition that was graciously funded by the Dalio Foundation. And this was a multi-institution effort, and we went ahead and surveyed all of the islands of the Danger Islands, the first expedition to do so. And what we discovered was that not only were we correct in thinking there were large Adélie penguin colonies in the Danger Islands, but in fact this small archipelago that measures only about 15 kilometers from one end to the other had more Adélie penguins than the entire rest of the Antarctic peninsula combined. In aggregate, about 1.5 million Adélie penguins living in this area that's so small that it doesn't even appear on most maps of the Antarctic. Since we discovered how valuable Landsat imagery would be to our survey of penguin populations, we went back through the record and in fact looked at all cloud-free Landsat imagery of the Antarctic coastline going back to 1982. Almost 40 years of Landsat imagery to understand how these populations may have changed over time. What we discovered is that because of Landsat, we now have triple the amount of information on penguin abundance. Nearly overnight, we have tripled how much we understand about how these populations have changed, even in the most remote corners of the Antarctic. We also have a much more detailed perspective on how these Adélie penguin populations have changed over the last 40 years. So one of the things we were very interested in is how have the population in the Danger Islands that we didn't previously even know about, how has it changed over the recent period? So what we discovered is that while the Adélie penguin population in the Danger Islands is massive, it in fact was even larger in the past. We believe that the Danger Islands population peaked in around the late 1990s and has been on a slow but steady decline ever since. So while our first impression was that this was one of the largest and maybe most healthy parts of the Antarctic Peninsula, in fact, while it is large, it may not be as healthy as we had once thought. So now that we've discovered this hotspot of Adélie abundance here in the Danger Islands, we want to be able to protect it, and that involves trying to understand why the populations may have changed. So just to summarize, satellites provide a really critical tool for keeping an eye on this important but exceptionally remote biological hotspot. So understanding the distribution and abundance of penguins doesn't do us any good as scientists if we can't communicate that to policymakers that at the end of the day are the ones responsible for conserving this fragile landscape. So with some funding from NASA, we created a portal called penguinmap.com where we have provided all available information on not just the Adélie penguin, but all of the Antarctic penguin species. And we're building this information superhighway whereby satellite information can go as quickly as possible to Penguin Map and into the hands of policymakers. So I've put my contact information there if you have any further questions. And then I'm going to hand it off to Casey that's going to tell you even more about what we can do with satellites and penguins.
All right. So Heather told us that we can use satellites to look at, monitor penguin populations using satellites, right? So to do this, we use the spectral signature of penguin guano here to distinguish it from all the other features that might be present in the Antarctic landscape. So by spectral signature, I'm essentially referring to the color of the penguin guano, but not just the color in that narrow band that we see as humans, this Roy G. Biv that we typically think about. These satellites actually sense into the infrared portions of that electromagnetic spectrum as well. So you can think of the spectral signature as a sort of expanded color palette that we're using. So on the left here, we can see this is a satellite image from Landsat 7. It's a NASA Earth observing satellite. The dark areas here are water. The white areas are snow or ice. Brown areas are rock. And those pinkish bits, those are penguins. So we can use this color of penguin guano to look at not only where penguins are, but also what penguins are eating. So basically the degree to which penguins are eating krill, these small shrimp-like creatures on the left here, versus fish. So this is the two principal components of the Adélie penguin's diet here. This is an Adélie penguin here in the center. So to do this, we collected a number of guano samples from the Danger Islands, as well as another number of other penguin colonies in the region. This is me processing these penguin guano samples, and what I should note is a very small, unventilated room in the belly of a ship in the Antarctic. It's quite smelly. I then use a spectrometer, a scientific instrument, to measure the color, a quantified measure of color for each of these samples, ran each of these samples through a chemical analysis to look at what these penguins are actually eating, and then we derived this quantitative relationship between color and diet using a bit of statistics. We can then use this relationship, scale that up to satellite sensors to then look at what penguins are eating from satellites. So the scale here is very important, scaling these efforts up to this regional scale. What is normally quite a logistically difficult, time-consuming, and expensive task of figuring out what these penguins are eating at each individual site, we can now do from satellites, from the comfort of our own desks. So this is 24,000 kilometers of Antarctic coastline, so I don't want to undersell the scale which the Antarctic is on. Each of these dots represents a penguin colony. More of these bluish hues represent colonies that eat primarily fish. This pinkish hue represent colonies that eat primarily krill. So what you can see is there's this clear regional difference of what we consider West Antarctica on the left here. That's primarily a krill-based diet, and more of a fish-based diet on the other side of the continent on the right in East Antarctica. So we are also interested in how diet might be changing over time. As Heather mentioned, one of the benefits of using satellites is that there's really a rich satellite archive. We can go back in time and look at what's happened over the last 30 years or so. Given that the Antarctic has experienced quite a number of changes in the physical environment over the past 3 decades, we might expect that diet has changed as well. However, that's not actually what we find. Surprisingly, we see very little trend in diet over time. Any change has really been quite negligible. So using these tools, it's really an important part of understanding how the Antarctic ecosystem is functioning and how it might change in response to a number of factors, including one, a growing krill fishery in the region. So really hunting for these krill for use in fish oil, krill oil supplements, as well as fish food for fish farms. as well as a changing physical environment, so increasing temperatures in the peninsula region at least, and changes in sea ice dynamics. So our hope is really that this can provide a tool for environmental managers to use to better inform policy decisions, particularly for CAMLAR. This is the international body that manages the Antarctic marine living resources. So our hope is that this can better inform policy decisions and help us better understand how the Antarctic might change in the future. So I just want to recognize NASA for funding this. This work was funded by a NASA Earth and Space Science Graduate Fellowship, so big thanks there. This is my contact info. I'm on Twitter. My website's there as well as my email. I'm also giving a poster on this tomorrow. Starting at 8 a.m., I should be there from at least 9 to 10, so feel free to get in touch. And I'll hand things over to Mike.
Okay, I'm Mike Polito from LSU. And I'm going to build on what Heather and Casey told you about and start off by telling you that satellites are amazing and the satellite record is long, but it does have a limit. So satellites can't really tell us about what penguins were doing, whether it's their diets or their populations, prior to the 1970s. So some important questions, and we'll take a look at it from the Danger Islands, is things like, when did penguins first arrive at the Danger Islands? Or how have their diets changed over larger timescales from hundreds of thousands of years? Those are questions, unfortunately, satellites can't answer for us. So basically, while it was Casey's job to measure the color of poop, it was my job to dig it up. And because that's the way we can actually answer these questions. So you can see here me and a colleague on the Danger Islands with our buckets digging holes in penguin colonies. And this is exactly what we would do. And you might wonder why we dig holes in penguin colonies. Well, it turns out penguins come back to the same ice-free area year after year. They make nests out of pebbles. They poop all over it. Their eggs crumble up. The chicks drop their feathers. And so over time, you get this wonderful deposition of ornithogenic soil, or bird-derived soil, that you can excavate, and it'll give you a time series of the ancient history of penguins over hundreds to thousands of years. So what we do is we dig down through these sediments until we get to the bottom of them, till we no longer see any evidence of penguins. And we dig a little deeper, obviously, to see if there's anything below that as well. But we can sieve through these sediments, find bones, feathers, other remains of penguins, use radiocarbon dating to estimate when penguins first arrived at an island. So looking at the Danger Islands, we found some really exciting results. And that is that penguins we found the first evidence of penguins occupying the Danger Islands a little less than 3,000 years ago. And this is exciting for two reasons. One, previous analysis in this area found very young occupations. So other colonies that have been dated were less than 600 years in this northeastern part of the Antarctic Peninsula. Whereas we found penguins first occupied this area around 3,000 years ago, which seems to match up a lot better with the climate record. So before this work, we didn't know if the lack of penguins was because we didn't find the right place to look for them, or it was because they weren't there. And it turned out that we had to go to what is the largest Adélie penguin colony in the Antarctic Peninsula to find what is some of the oldest records of occupation in the area. And so you might wonder, why is it important to understand about where penguins were in the past? Well, it turns out penguins, especially Adélie penguins, they not only act as a canary in the coal mine for current conditions, but they also act as a good proxy or indicator of past climate conditions. That's because Adélie penguins need ice-free land to breed, and open water access, and good marine food supplies for nesting. So too much ice might give them not enough open water near their colonies, or might not give them enough open land to breed. Too little ice would reduce the amount of productivity for their food chain. So the presence or absence of penguins act as a proxy for this window of climate conditions in the past. In addition, work that we'll be continuing to do is actually pull out things like feathers and eggshell fragments from penguins that we've recovered over time and analyze them to understand what they've been eating in the same sorts of analyses, chemical analyses, that Casey did to calibrate that satellite-based sensing. So this will allow us to understand how penguin diets have changed over time in response to past climatic conditions. So keep in touch. We have a lot of data to dig through, and I'll try to limit that to the only pun of the day. And this work, in addition to the support from the Dalio Foundation to get us there, it's been really supported by NSF Office of Polar Programs to allow us to dig deep into the past and understand how penguins have responded to past climate. And I'm on Twitter. My website's up there in contact, and be happy to join with my colleagues in answering your questions.
We're good? Okay, great. Okay, we'll now open up to questions from reporters in the room. Please state your name and affiliation.
I'm Harvey Lyford, freelancer. Just a couple of questions. Are the other three species, do the other three species also poop pink, or is that not a way you can distinguish one species from another?
Yeah, so all of the penguins, they all poop a lot, to be honest. There is some regional constrictions here, so Adélie penguins are found circumpolar distribution, so around the continent. Others are more isolated to the northern Antarctic Peninsula. Adélie penguins are also unique in that they pack quite tightly. Some of the other penguins don't nest as near one another, so it's a little bit more sparse. So it's a little bit more difficult to detect those populations from satellites, but you can still see them. It's just a little bit more difficult. Adélies are sort of a prime penguin for looking at diet and population dynamics from satellites.
Hi, Sid Perkins, freelance. One of your presentations talked about how, they're the largest number of Adélie penguins, but there are hints that in the past they were much more populous and they may have declined. And then also you mentioned something about the krill fisheries. And I was wondering if there is any sort of connection between the two that can be discerned or correlated, and whether or not they're causative. Is the decline in the penguin population there in any way correlated with the increase of krill fisheries?
So it's a great question. It's one of the things that we think a lot about as to what might be causing these changes. In this case, the sea ice around the danger islands, as I mentioned, the reason they're called the danger islands is the best protection that they have. And so we don't have the kinds of krill fishing in that area that we have on the western Antarctic Peninsula. Which isn't to say that we wouldn't worry about in the future if in fact there's less sea ice moving forward. But our best hypothesis, working hypothesis at this point, is probably that it's related to climate. But again, it was quite unexpected that we would have seen the decline. It's not catastrophic. We're looking at something on the order of 10 to 20% decline, not nearly what we've already seen on the western Antarctic Peninsula.
Are there other questions from reporters in the room?
Hi, I'm Brian Resnick with Vox. Just wondering, in these satellite photos, are the markings like something you or I could see, or is it like more subtle than that? Can you actually just zoom in on these photos and see pink stains among the ice?
Well, you totally can. And in fact, if you go to penguinmap.com, we created Be a Penguin Detective. And you can click on that link and we teach you how to look for penguin colonies in satellite imagery. And then you can go to Google Earth and we have a file that you can just drag and drop into Google Earth and it will show you where all the known penguin colonies in Antarctica are. And if you find one that's not on our list, let us know. We have an email address there. And in fact, we have a number of citizen scientists out there that look through Google satellite imagery and let us know when they discover colonies that we didn't know existed before. So it's one of the ways that we hope to search out colonies that we may not yet have discovered.
Does that happen often?
The public likes to look for emperor penguins, and so that's what they do. So what we have discovered is that the emperor penguin colonies, because they're on sea ice rather than on land, actually move around a lot more. So we haven't discovered new ones, but we've discovered a lot about their behavior through the work of citizen scientists. But it certainly we continue to discover new colonies with satellite images every time we look, and I'm sure that there are more out there that we don't yet know about.
Hi, Eric Nealer at Wired. So there must be other ways to count penguins as well. Could you tell us about those and how the satellite compares to that, and also whether you can use satellites for sort of hindcasting to, I mean, you showed the graph with the early Landsats from the 70s. Can you look at old images?
So one of the things we did as soon as that we had discovered the danger islands is do exactly that, and we went back to look at every image taken in any way going back in the past. And so we went and looked at historic air photo imagery going back from the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. And sure enough, you can see the penguin colonies quite clearly in that old air photo imagery. And we were able to show how the population had changed, going back as far as that. But certainly one of the things that we did in the danger islands, which was really exciting, was to bring a drone and to map these colonies from drone imagery, where we can see each individual penguin head on the landscape. And so in this case, our counts from the danger islands were from drone imagery counting heads, but we were able to use that to calibrate our estimates from the satellite imagery.
In addition to a whole lot of in situ counting of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yeah.
There's a lot of direct counting.
Well, the joke is that you count the number of legs and you divide by 2.
Yeah.
But I'll add one thing though. Some work previous to this, just to give you kind of the sense of the challenge of counting penguins, is traditionally, it was spending a lot of man hours going through and trying to visually divide up colonies, count them by hand, enumerate them. We did an expedition to a place called Deception Island a few years back, where we were there for over a week with about 5 people, and it took us that long to count a colony of around 50,000 penguins. And then Heather's did the analysis on satellite imagery, and she was basically spot on to what we did by hand. So it really is amazing how good the satellites can be when you understand the conditions of the imagery.
Harvey Lyford, freelance again. I'm not clear exactly where the danger islands are. If you went straight north, what country would you hit?
So I think of the Antarctic as being like you're hitchhiking. I know that's gone out of fashion these days, but like if you hold up your fist with your thumb sticking out, the Antarctic Peninsula is going to be your thumb, and it's pointing towards South America. And the danger islands are essentially your thumbnail. So right at the tip of your thumb would be the danger islands.
Okay. And the second question is mapping the number of penguins by the area of the guano. Is that right? Well, that assumes, I think, that they always poop in a new place. Don't some penguins poop over previous poop?
So I'm going to start that, and then I'm going to pass it to Mike, because old poop is Mike's area. I will say that, in fact, they will go exactly back to the same nest spot that they nested in previously. And so in many ways, the challenge of a colony that we know about isn't in finding them. It's, in fact, distinguishing new guano from old guano. And so in areas of the Antarctic where it's very dry and the guano doesn't wash away, we do have to worry about picking up the signature of guano that may not actually reflect the population in that year. But because penguin populations change relatively slowly, we don't think that our estimates are unduly biased by any wiggle room around the edges where we're picking up old guano.
Yeah, and definitely the fact that these species of penguins come back to the same place year after year and build up this deposition, it's really great for to understand their past history. And the work that we presented on the danger islands was us excavating active colonies, so where there's penguins now. But we've also done some work in this area and other areas where we go to abandoned colonies, and we can identify abandoned colonies from that pink soil. So there's no penguins there, but if we go and there's a raised area that has the right size pebbles, if you dig in a little bit and you see this reddish color, then if you dig a little deeper, you're going to start finding bones and eggshells. And so understanding where penguins used to be but aren't now is just as important to understanding how they've responded to climate as it is to understanding how long penguins have been at the place that they are now.
Hi, Sid Perkins again. In your analyses of, krill versus fish versus some sort of mixing proportions, how did you do that? Was that just isotopic analysis of nitrogen, or what blend of things, and what things did you analyze to come up with that?
Yeah, you're spot on with the stable isotopes. So we're looking at the delta nitrogen 15 values. Basically, they're telling us where in the food web those penguins are feeding. Higher values would be higher trophic level prey, so something like fish. Lower values would be lower trophic level prey, lower in the food web, things like krill. So that is actually the quantitative relationship that we built up between that spectral profile, the color, and those delta nitrogen 15 values.
What was it, feathers or eggshells or a little of?
Oh, it's the poop.
Oh, okay.
It's all about the poop.
Are there any more questions from reports in the room? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Christina Larson from the Associated Press. I had a couple questions. Did you discover the guano visible from satellite? Was that an accidental discovery? Was it something you were looking at? How did you key in onto that? And are other species that you might know of? I mean, is this a unique thing to penguin, like only penguin poop visible from space? Or like, is this a strategy that other biologists are using? And then the third question is what are the new research questions you're trying to answer going forward? Thanks.
So I'll tackle at least the first two, and I'm sure you're going to get three answers to the third. But it was, in fact, a completely accidental discovery. We thought that my colleague Michelle LaRue and I, many years ago at this point, did what we thought was a complete pan-Antarctic survey for Adélie penguin colonies. We looked at every single cloud-free image that we had available all the way around the Antarctic. It took us 10 months of searching, and we thought that we had completed the survey. We thought that we knew where all the penguin colonies were, all the Adélie penguin colonies. My colleague Matt Schwaller at NASA had created an algorithm to automate the detection of penguin colonies from Landsat imagery, and his algorithm was sort of bing, bing, bing. It was flagging all of these pixels in the danger islands that we hadn't previously been really focused on. And sure enough, when we went back to look more carefully, it turns out that we, as human annotators, had simply just missed these really, really large populations, which I think speaks to the importance of computer automation. The computer is not biased by its own expectations of where to find things. And so we, I think, had missed it in part because we hadn't expected to find them there. As to the second question, we can, in fact, wefind any guano-producing bird that's out in the open. So we've done, for example, a pan-Antarctic survey of Antarctic petrels. We're working on snow petrels, on blue-eyed shags. So this could be extended to boobies, to cormorants, and I think we're only just scratching the surface of what we can do in terms of tracking seabirds from space. As to the next big research questions, I'll start with Mike down there, and we can work our way back.
Well, I think the next big thing for us is to build on that dietary component over time. We've found some really interesting trends in the past to suggest that maybe this idea that Adélie penguins in certain places eating a lot of krill may be a very recent phenomenon, and that fish was more important in the diet in the past. That's some evidence that we found based on bulk stable isotope analysis from previous work. But we've been able to collect a lot more samples, and we've been able to really refine for penguins a newer technique that doesn't just look at the bulk stable isotope signature, but the values of individual amino acids, which is much more robust at estimating diet. And so we're really hoping to be able to see if this change in isotope signatures in the past were related to changes in diet, or if they were related to changes in the base of the food web. So did the penguins change their diets, or was the whole food web changing? And to be able to link that to some of the climate variation in the past will be really important to help understand their responses to current climate change.
Yeah, so from my perspective on the near term, one of the things that we want to look at is what environmental factors are driving these regional differences in diet across the continent. And then secondly, maybe more importantly, any linkages between diet and population dynamics, so population trends. So that's sort of the next thing that we're doing. It does look like there's something there, but it's not quite ready yet. We're just sort of wrapping up some analyses. And then, as Heather mentioned, I just think that applying these same sorts of methods to other seabirds is just a really exciting frontier on the ecology and remote sensing front.
Right.
Christoph Seidler, Spiegel Online. One question: when we have the two distinct ways of feeding with the krill and the fish. Why is that after all? I mean, there should be krill everywhere, there should be fish everywhere. So why do we see that distinction after all?
The regional distinction?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out. There is some preliminary evidence from other groups that there are fewer Antarctic silverfish, which is really what they're feeding on in the Antarctic Peninsula region. So it could be that Adélie penguins in that area are more constrained. They don't have, there's no option for them to switch to other prey resources. Maybe in other areas of the Antarctic, there are more Antarctic silverfish. There is some evidence to support that. This may be related to sea ice dynamics. Preliminary analyses have shown that at the site level, icier years tend to be linked to more fishy diets, but that's still, as I mentioned, another one of these things that we're still investigating. Yeah, so it's really an open question.
And I think just to wrap up what Casey said, the technology is still very new. So now that we know that we can use satellites to look at penguin diet, we're looking at a decade or more of really cool science questions that we can't wait to get to. Because 5 years ago, we weren't asking these questions because we didn't have any means by which to answer them.
Okay. Can you talk, you talked briefly, but I don't think I caught it all, about how you came up with the age estimate for the population?
Yeah, be happy to do that. So basically, we can excavate through the colony, through the deposition created by the penguins, and we can pull out a bone or a feather or some penguin remain at the base of that, at the bottom of those deposits, where if you go any deeper, there's no longer any evidence of penguins. It's just sort of sterile beach sand. And that is sort of the first evidence of a penguin occupying that site. And we can do radiocarbon dating on that, and it gives us a range of with some error around it as to when that site was occupied for the first time. I will say one of the kind of exciting things is that we're really excited about actually using some of the satellite imagery data to help us constrain our estimates of where penguins were, because the colonies as we see them are not what they look like thousands of years ago. Sea level was different at that time. So we're really excited about using some satellite imagery to understand elevation of these islands and other areas to help constrain what land masses might have been available to these penguins in the past. And if we see penguins at a site, is that because that site was underwater? Or if we don't see penguins at a site, is because that site was underwater in the past?
Does the information that you have about when these penguins first arrived, does that tell you anything about when those islands became unsnow covered, so to speak, as coming out of the last ice age? Or again, does it more reflect some sort of change in sea level that made them available at that elevation?
That's a great question. There's definitely both scenarios, and it could differ by location. And I think that's why it's really important to understand the elevation of these sites and the past history. One of the sort of questions we had going into this was that previous work in the northeastern part of the Antarctic Peninsula found all these very young sites, less than 600 years. Whereas if you look at sort of the general paleoclimatic record, you would have expected that deglaciation following the last glacial maximum, would have made those areas accessible to penguins much earlier. So it was always kind of an open question as to why penguins weren't there. And it turned out in this case, we weren't looking in the right place. It wasn't until we looked at the Danger Islands that we found evidence around 3,000 years. Are
there other questions from reporters in the room? No? Are there any questions on the chat? No? Okay, great. That concludes our press conference. Thank you very much.